We see that in our society more and more every day, where we're told that the problem with people is not so much sin as it is a lack of self-esteem. But to a great degree, now to a certain degree that may be true, but to a great degree I think the reverse is true. We have too much self-esteem and we don't realize what our condition really is, which would drive us to God. So, sin is ungodliness. We see a second characteristic of sin, and that's its pervasiveness. It indeed affects every part of us. Sin affects every part of our human condition, every faculty, every function, including our mind, our emotions, and our wills. Verses 13 through 17. Their throats are open graves, their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips, their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness, their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, in the way of peace they do not know. The very parts of the body that God gave us to serve others and glorify Him are perverted and used in a way that we fight against one another and glorify self, and even, Paul says, curse God. And yet those are the very faculties that God gave us, intending for us to glorify Him with them. And so everything is reversed. Everything is turned upside down. If you will remember, Paul in another place says that a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough. And in fact, Jesus also said that when He was talking to His disciples. It doesn't take a whole lot of yeast. Those of you who bake know that you just use a little bit. Now, there was one time when a friend of ours, an older lady, was in the process of baking some bread. And it was bread that had to work every so often to keep it from swelling. Well, her husband decided that he wanted to go visit their daughter in Hereford. She said, I can't leave this bread. He said, well, just bring it with you. So she took the bread covered with a cup towel, dish towel, and put it in the back seat. However, the car was warm from the sunshine, and it began to rise. Now, it was only a little bit of yeast, but it was affecting everything. And so she climbed over, this was before the time when you had to wear seatbelts, she climbed over the seat and began to work this dough down. And it just seemed like she couldn't get ahead of it. In fact, it was overtaking her. And she told her husband, why don't you just pull over to the side of the road, I'll dump this stuff out and we'll go on to Hereford. Which he did. And she did. And they got in the car and they went to visit their daughter. They were there for 2 or 3 hours. As they were coming back to Amarillo, about the place where she had dumped the dough, there were DPS officers, sheriff's deputies, blocking the highway. And as they stopped, they said, what's going on? And he pointed over to this thing and he said, folks, we don't know what this is, but just stay away from it. She said she kept her mouth shut and they just drove back to Amarillo. But you see, it took just a little bit of yeast to completely overcome that whole batch of dough. And that's exactly how sin is. It's pervasive. It affects every part of us. A third characteristic of sin that we see here is its universality. Verse 12, all have turned away. What does all mean? Everybody. What has everybody done? Turned away. It's reminiscent of what Isaiah said. All we, like sheep, have gone astray, everyone to his own way. me, is that not true? The evil of human nature that is portrayed here by Paul is not a call to hopelessness, but rather a challenge to hope. The situation seems bleak. The situation seems hopeless. The situation seems without remedy. There's a glimmer of hope. And we'll see that in the next section. The ungodliness of sin, the pervasiveness of sin, and the universality of sin. What's the result? Verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced, and the whole world held accountable to God. How much will be held accountable? The whole world. Do you remember what Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5:10? We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. There are no exceptions. Now the Jews thought they would be exempt because they were God's chosen people and they had the law. Certainly that's one of those get out of jail free cards, is it not? Paul says no. And the Gentiles could plead ignorance. We didn't know. Paul says no. You knew enough. And so we're all guilty. We are all guilty. Every mouth stopped, every excuse silenced, and the whole world, having been proven guilty, is liable to God's judgment. The weight of evidence is overwhelming. It's not one of those situations where, well, there's a little bit of evidence, some of it's circumstantial. No. Just so that we don't think that, well, maybe we skirted through without some of this affecting us. Paul says, look, how do you argue with this? And indeed we cannot. It completely overwhelms us, the amount, the volume, the weight of evidence. And then he goes on to say in verse 20 that no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. Literally what it says is by works of the law. By works of the law. And Paul emphasized not so much the freeness of God's grace, which is as opposed to merit, but rather the impartiality, which goes against elitism. Everyone is included. All have gone astray. The whole world will stand before God's judgment seat. The whole world will be declared guilty. And the very reason that the law cannot justify sinners is precisely that that's not its function. Look what Paul says the function of the law is. Through the law we become conscious of sin. That's why the law was given. So that we might be aware of sin, so that we might be conscious of it. In Galatians, Paul calls it our pedagogos, our child leader, to bring us to Christ. The law was not given so that we might stand right before God. The law was given to reveal how helpless we were and how hopeless we were. And the reason the law condemns us is that we break it. The law brings knowledge of sin, but it cannot bring forgiveness, which is what we so desperately need. Martin Luther said, quote, "The principal point of the law is to make men not better, but worse. That is to say, it shows unto them their sin, that by the knowledge thereof they may be humbled, terrified, bruised, and broken, and by this means may be driven to seek grace."